According to the World Health Organization, or the WHO, 90% of people who live in cities do not breathe safe air. And 6.5 million people die each year from diseases that are related to air pollution. Along with air pollution, climate change will also bring about drought, floods, heat waves, disease, loss of food from destroyed crops, and all of which will lead to global conflicts, which will likely result in wars. The WHO predicts that there will be about 250,000 deaths per year from 2030 to 2050 that are caused by climate change. This important issue is supported by economists on both sides of the political spectrum. And if we want to save our planet and curb climate change, we must work together to enforce a carbon tax. The United States accounts for around 20% of the world's CO2 emissions, and each American emits around 5 times as much CO2 as the average non-American, explained the Carbon Tax Center. Today, I'll explain the importance of why we need to implement a carbon tax here in the United States and the benefits once we do so. First, I will explain First, I will define a carbon tax, and I will tell you why we need to enforce one here. Carbon dioxide, or CO2, is released into the Earth's atmosphere when we burn fossil fuels like natural gas, oil, and coal. And this makes up around 82% of the total greenhouse gas emissions in the United States, according to the Department of Energy. And as you can see in this chart here, currently in the United States, only 10% of our energy comes from renewable resources. A carbon tax is a fee that is intended to make users of fossil fuels pay for the climate damage their fuel use imposes by releasing CO2 into the Earth's atmosphere. And as the Congressional Budget Office explained in the 2008 report, a tax on carbon emissions would be the most efficient, incentive-based option for reducing our CO2 emissions, and it's going to be relatively easy to implement. Placing a tax on carbon gives consumers and producers a monetary incentive to reduce their CO2 use. And this would also encourage the transition to cleaner energy sources like wind, solar, and geothermal. Once we put in place a carbon tax, the benefits can be seen fairly quickly. The revenue that is generated from the carbon tax will go towards green renewable energy and energy-saving projects that will be used to phase out our reliance on fossil fuels. In the National Geographic documentary Before the Flood, it was explained that some nations and states may return some of that revenue back to taxpayers in the form of other tax reductions, like a payroll tax or sales tax reduction. And this will especially help those from lower income families because it'll help offset the carbon tax. The model for successfully implementing this tax in the Western Hemisphere can be seen in the province of British Columbia in Canada, where they decreased their emissions by 12.9% from 2008 to 2013. And in Ireland, they dropped their CO2 emissions by 15% since 2008. And this is all from a report by the Carbon Tax Center. And in Australia, they enforced the carbon tax for 2 years, but then they repealed it. And you can see how that affected the CO2 by this chart here, where this is when they implemented the CO2 tax for 2 years, and you can see how the emissions dropped. And then once they repealed it, which is shown by this red line, you can see how the emissions started to creep back up again. Here in the United States, Senator Bernie Sanders is the leader in the carbon tax movement. And he said that the carbon fee would apply to around 3,000 of the largest fossil fuel polluters, and this would cover around 85% of the United States greenhouse gas emissions. And the Congressional Budget Office estimated that Sanders' plan would reduce greenhouse gas emissions by about 20% by 2025, and it would also generate $1.2 trillion in revenue over 10 years. And Sanders' bill also returns 60% of that revenue back to the taxpayers, and that will go to offset costs that the carbon tax may induce, like an increase in fuel prices. And the rest of that revenue will go towards investments in renewable energy. It would weatherize 1 million homes a year. It would fund $1 billion a year in worker training programs. And finally, it would put hundreds of billions of dollars into reducing national debt. To conclude, as you've learned today, the need is dire to stop and reverse our CO2 emissions. And once implementing a carbon tax, the benefits can be seen in countries like Canada and Ireland. And the revenue generated from the carbon tax will also create jobs and will reduce our national debt, and this is all while saving our planet. It is time to stand up to the fossil fuel industry, who are just looking to make a short-term profit. We must take bold action so we can leave a habitable planet for our grandchildren.